那今天主题演讲者哈是来自澳洲的那个 Hernan Cuervo 哈 Professor 哈。那这个 Hernan 教授他本身哈，其实他研究的就是有关，特别是偏向教育哈。那他当然我们刚刚也提了哈，刚刚讨论过，我们也共同的兴趣也是在社会学领域哈。特别今天主题是谈到那个迈向社会正义的偏乡教育哈。他从那个分配正义以及认可正义这两个主要的观点出发哈。那我知道我们在做很多在中小学现场的老师们哈，还有我们这里也有师培工作者哈，就是我们有些在教育大学师大里头都包括我们政大也都是培育中小学师资哈。那其实我们面临的是同样的问题哈，就是怎么样在偏乡教育培养出最好的老师哈，然后也可以留得住哈。刚刚我跟这个 Hernan 教授提到，就是说其实我们有共同的问题哈，那我看到他最近的文章也是在写说怎么样，就是师培的部分哈，师资培育的部分，怎么样去留住偏乡的老师啊？你要给他一个理由，我觉得这个真的很不容易哈，因为我最近也到有一些偏乡学校去哈，它流动率很高哈，就是一个学期换了好多代课老师，已经好几个了，不是一个学期哈，他就换了，就流动率相当高哈。那我相信今天的这个演讲哈，会让大家收获满满。那首先我们会跟刚刚一样，我们会40分钟的演讲哈，接着我们抓紧时间哈来做问答哈。那让我们欢迎那个 Professor Cuervo。OK。
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. I want to start by thanking the Professor Chen and his colleagues. You know who you are, the committee organizer, for being so kind and for this invitation and for making us feel welcome and truly having a wonderful experience so far. I want to also thank you, all of you, for coming Sunday morning, quite cold and rainy, to listening to us talk about education. And as per in Australia, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation, the past and present leaders, where this presentation was prepared, where this research has taken place. Before starting, I also want to acknowledge that I come originally from Argentina and not from Australia, but I have lived in Australia now for almost 20 years, perhaps a little bit less. And today I'm going to talk about a research project that I conducted some years ago and produce a book and several journal articles. Of course, I'm going to update a little bit that information, particularly in terms of a theory. My talk is titled Towards a Socially Just Rural Education, the Uses of Distributive and Recognitive Justice, Distribution or Distributive and Recognition Justice. My final disclaimer is I tend to digress quite a lot. My students know that. I tend to speak not to the slide, but to something completely different. They get the slide before the lecture, so I don't worry so much. They seem to like it, and I have an hour and 15 minutes. But here I have somebody really in front of me saying I have 40 minutes. My hunch is you should have brought my wife, because my wife tells me, what's the point of all this? Get to the point. Hurry up. You're talking too much. Really? What's that all about? Come on, let's go do that. God's sake. But she's not here, so I'm going to do my best to try to keep to the slides. I'm going to, in some instances, read from the slides, which is something that I never do, for the sake of the translation and for the sake of keeping the time and being organized for once in my life. There is the book that I produced some years ago. And the aim of this presentation is to identify and understand rural school participants, discourses and practices that contribute to pluralized social justice in education. By rural school participants, I mean students, teachers, principals, parents, but also community members that perhaps don't have a child or a family member in the school. They still have a relationship with the school and in the school, particularly in small communities, as one of the two communities that I'm going to talk about today. So, why ask what social justice means? In some ways, as I tell my students of research methodology, why bother reading your research proposal? Why should I do that? Abstract conceptualizations of social justice are useful to organize the messiness of social life. If you think about governments, if you are a bureaucrat, a public servant, a minister of education, well, some sort of principles of justice, being that justice, if we go back to Plato and Aristotle and so forth, is the greatest virtue of society, or one of the principles that organizes what is fair in society, and the rights and the burdens for citizens or members of that polity or of that society, then abstract conceptualizations are very important. The problem is that life is a little bit more messy than abstract conceptualization, and social justice is an elusive concept often used as a self-explanatory concept, if I could repeat that word. For example, Professor David Miller in the University of Oxford, in a 2014 book called Justice for Earthlings, tend to say when people are asked what do they mean by social justice, they tend to some intuitive form of response, basically around fairness and equality, i.e. the idea we should all be equal, without taking into consideration where you're coming from, where you're going, your social group, your social background, and so forth. Alistair McIntyre will say in his book, Whose Justice, Whose Virtue, that you will have as many responses about what justice means as members of society or members of social groups. So asking what people think about justice is important because A, it can work as an action guide for policy. For example, positions around school finding, the same-sex marriage. We have a plebiscite in Australia a few years ago that shows position of people around an area that affects perhaps a minority of people in Australia, maybe 5–10%, I'm not sure how many, but it tends to tell you what people think of justice. It could be about taxation, it could be about any issue, not just related to schooling. And it also helps us understand people's choices, actions, and relationships. For example, relationships between students and teachers, between teachers and teachers in the staff room, between teachers and administrators, and so forth. Justice, or the idea and practice of justice, organizes much of society in one way or another. Something that you're finding out here, I'm not very good with diagrams. This is a homemade one, so, well, you will apologize me. But here I have the idea, the place of rurality in education policy in Australia, I should add there. And what I have here is a series of policies, not all of them, starting, as you are looking, started in 1973, the Karma Report. I could make many readings out of this. I could go the whole lecture just with this slide, which of course I'm not going to do. But the point that I want to make is from early 1970s with the Labour government from Gough Whitlam, we have a greater contract, a social contract between the state and some social groups, including young people, indigenous people, rural people, women, people with a disability situation, and so forth. But in terms of rural education, what these policies, some of them are generic policies. By that I mean they don't touch just upon rurality, but education in general. Some of them pertain particularly to rurality, like strengthening Australian schools, or for example, the Halsey report in 2018. And there's a few more recently that, of course, my lack of ability to put another circle didn't allow me to put. But in any case, you can find it or you can ask me later. What is the point of this slide? The point is, as I think Professor Corbett was saying yesterday in his talk, or in our many talks in these last few days, Rurality or rural education has become also an equity category, just as indigenous people. What do I mean by this? In many instances, rurality, indigenous people, in the 70s, women, individuals with a disability and so forth, are used as what is wrong with education, as the group that is lagging behind. That is, they are always presented in a deficit view. They're always constructed as a problem that needs to be fixed by the state, fixed by experts, fixed by academics, and so forth. Maybe I will fall into this trap in this lecture. I hope I don't, or I hope I give another view. But that is, I think, one of the problematic uses of rural education or rurality in education policy. And I will suspect this is not just in Australia, but elsewhere. Education policy and social justice. We have view not just in Australia. I'm not so sure Taiwan, as I'm not an expert in education policy in your country, although I have been learning a great deal in the past few days. But in many other countries, what people loosely call neoliberalism, which is a very loose term, and which means in practice many different things in different contexts, so I'm avoiding or trying not to use it. I'd like to better talk about what Carlos Torres, the Hispanic American academic, tends to say, a new common sense, a new idea of what education is for. And I think this is what the previous talk by our esteemed colleague from Japan and by other colleagues yesterday was about. What is education for at the end of the day? What do we want education to be for? Or in this case, what do we want rural education to be for? And Torres will say there's a new common sense where education is seen as property rights rather than personal rights. My colleague Faisal Rizvi at the University of Melbourne and Bob Linger, another esteemed colleague in Australia, have said, yes, there has been a shift on how parents, how the state, how teachers, how students, how society see education. In the sense that in the past it was a personal right, a right that you have to be educated as a member of society. And today is a property right, is a capital, something that you acquire, something that you purchase in order to trade in the labor market or to trade later in life to follow your aspirations and so forth. Per se, I'm not saying this is completely wrong. Education has an instrumental part to it, but we have moved so far to think really about education as the accumulation of capital rather than the possibility of everybody seen as a common good. This, of course, you would imagine very easily has repercussion for those that have the least resources in society. And as a person that comes from Argentina, which is a much profoundly inegalitarian or unequal society than, for that matter, Taiwan, and not to mention Australia, this creates winners and losers. And that is dangerous, not just for the losers, but also for the winners, trust me. But what happened here in this new common sense of education, we also have a re-articulation of social justice under the marriage of efficiency and equity. We have what I said before and other people have mentioned before, equity groups, people that we have to lift, indigenous people, rural people, and so forth, through policy technologies. Martin Thrupp in New Zealand will say 20 years ago, and also Stephen Ball and many others, through policy technologies of accountability, performativity, monitoring, auditing, and so forth. The goal is to help the national economy in a time of globalization. I think, again, it was Professor Corbett that brought Francis Fukuyama's idea, the history, the end of history. You know, the notion of the Eastern Bloc is gone, in the Cold War is finished, capitalism had triumphed, and so forth. And what we have is a speed up of globalization through technologies and so on. Well, countries like Australia, with the promotion of policies coming from the OECD and so on, the World Bank and other international organizations, see education also as serving the national economy. This has an impact on teachers' works. I'm going to focus quite a bit on teachers' works today, on rural teachers' work. It has an impact on the culture of testing and reporting that displays the ownership of their work. Now their work is mandated to teach to the test, at least in Australia for a great part. When we have in Australia a program called NAPLAN that basically tests grade 3, 5, and 7 in literature, numeracy, and so on. And it works to show how good or bad teachers are doing in educating the new generation. And of course, it helps to bring that kind of teaching bashing teachings because students are not doing so well and so forth. And also, marketization of knowledge. Successful schools are created through tests that are assumed to be neutral. And we know that there's pretty much nothing neutral about education. We know that education is not just something, the knowledge or curriculum we have in education is not neutral, but it's created by somebody. And insofar it's created by somebody, an institution, a group, a bunch of white men in Australia in a room, we know there's a position, an ideology, a morality, and so forth. I want to move a little bit into a few theories of justice. Here is the great Iris Marion Young, who passed away in 2006. And who has done terrific work for us to understand what justice means. One of the first issues that Iris Marion Young took against distributive justice, or probably John Rawls' theory of justice, justice as fairness, in the sense of to each according its due, or the idea of distribution of responsibilities and rights, was the impossibility of viewing social justice as universal, impartial, or a neutral concept. And I have there the title or the phrase, a view from nowhere. That really is from Thomas Nagel's book. And Thomas Nagel, or Nagel, sorry my pronunciation, never knew what is the correct way to pronounce his last name, has this idea that if we go to the hills of Taipei and we look down to Taipei city and all its beauty and all its messy of social relationship, and I create the laws of socially just laws of Taipei without really knowing what's going on in the ground in Taipei, probably I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. That abstract view of life, of social relationship, needs to be contextualized. And for Iris Marion Young, she went a little bit further than Nagel by saying, well, there's nothing universal or impartial or neutral. There's always a dominant group that creates the laws, the knowledge, the curriculum, the way of looking at a school. The two schools that we visit, I think Thursday or Friday with our colleagues from the Experimental Education Center, well, I'm sure somebody is providing or producing the guidelines of what those schools should look like, either the states or the parents or whoever it is. So contextualizing social justice is very important. It cannot be defined or understood as an abstraction, but within the specific context of interpretation and enactment. That is also a little bit the words of Sharon Gerwitz in King's College in the United Kingdom, where she says, it's very easy to demand from teachers to be socially just. It's very easy to demand from them to do the right thing. But we need to understand the mediated nature where just practices are being produced, i.e. we need to understand the pressures that teachers might be through from, as yesterday Kath Christie was saying, from Ofsted, from the organization that control teachers and evaluate their schools and so forth, from their principals, from their colleagues, maybe from their partners, from parents, from teachers and so forth. Young wanted to focus, the other thing is Young wanted to focus on justice as domination of oppression. She wanted to move away from distributive justice, not completely, it's not that she denied distributive justice, but she thought much of justice was reduced to the distribution of resources, and that doesn't tell all the picture. All the picture of what happened in education is not who gets what, or how much money a school gets, and so forth. It also has to be with relationship, with power, with knowledge, with the construction of the curriculum, and so forth. There was a long debate between Iris Marion Young and Nancy Fraser, which I will bring in a second, where Fraser accused Young of forgetting about distributive justice and making everything about difference. Here we have this great book from 1990, I very strongly recommend reading it. I'm sure many of you have done it, Justice and the Politics of Recognition. It's not that Yang really moved away from distributive justice. She also wanted to talk about recognition. She wanted to talk about recognition of different social groups. She was from the United States, and she was interested in the recognition of people in situation of poverty, or of African American, of gay and lesbians, as she put it, of people with disability and so forth. Later in life, she has a book called Responsibility, Justice for Responsibility, 2006. I don't think she finished it, actually. She almost finished, somebody finished it for her, but where she moves more into global justice and so forth. So the point that I'm trying to make is Yang says we need to move from the distributive dimension that reduces social justice to distribution of resources to a recognition of social difference and political analysis of procedural issues of participation and decision making. Who gets the chance to speak? Which social groups and individuals? And recognition of justice is recognition of different cultures and values of all social groups and individuals, which form the core of their dignity, self-esteem, self-respect, and where misrecognition is a form of oppression. That sounds also very closely to Charles Taylor, but Charles Taylor was more interested in, if I could put it, in multiculturalism. He said misrecognition or recognition became a human right. And to finish with a theory of justice, being in 20 minutes, half the lecture, I think I'm doing good. I'm going to bring Axel Honneth and Nancy Fraser. And there is a book that I also strongly recommend, where you can get pretty much, it's from 2003, 20 years ago. Of course, I have written many more things, these two brilliant scholars, but you can get a very good idea of the main concepts of Honneth and Fraser and their differences, you know? And it's a debate about normative monism framework versus Fraser's perspective of dualism. While Fraser believes that remedies to injustice and inequalities might often require both distribution, economic justice, and recognition, cultural justice, for example, better allocation of material resources and the adequate institutional cultural value given to different social groups of youth or students, Honneth recognizes that material resources and cultural resignification, for example, the cultural resignification of rural knowledge and rural ways of being, are important aspects to redress injustices. But he believes that recognition, including providing social respect to all individuals and social groups, precedes distributive measures and forms the core of justice. At the end of the day, the difference is that for Honneth, inequities of distributive matter, while you get less of something, might be experienced by some social group like indigenous people in Australia because of their misrecognition in society or in the societal order or in the social order or by social institutions. That is, the misrecognition of your cultural status and your importance precedes the distribution of that resource that you are not getting. I'm going to move now to a little bit about the study that I conducted a few years ago in two communities. And I'm going to bring some of the voices of students and teachers to get a little bit out of theory and for you to have a sense of what some people in just two communities in rural Victoria say about teaching and being and living and thinking about rurality. I acknowledge this is just two communities of the hundreds of communities in rural Victoria, so I'm not here claiming this is what happened in all parts of rural Australia. This was a 3-year qualitative exploratory study of social justice in rural schooling. One school was a P12. P12 means that it was from kindergarten to grade 12, or year 12 as we call it in Australia. And the other one was a high school. I visited both schools in town for a few times, staying more days every time. The first time, of course, I just went to introduce me. It was quite interesting because I was just arrived to Australia and my accent, well, now is a beautiful Australian accent. At that time, it was pretty much an Argentinian heavy accent. So it was kind of a novelty, particularly in the first town where it's was a locality of 300 people. So I felt a little bit of a celebrity for a while, but that went away quite quickly, and that was kind of disappointing too. In any case, I did interviews and focus group with students, teachers, principal, parents, and community members. I realized very quickly that it's not just the people involved in the school, the people that have a stake, immediate stake in the school, but this whole community has a stake in the school, particularly when they're small. There is one of the schools, as you can see in the photo. These are the two towns. One is the bottom one is the other school, and in the top one is the farming community. It's not even a town, it's a locality with 300 people. It's farmers located in the northwest part of the state of Victoria, just before you get into the outback, before you get into the desert. And what you see is all that the town is about. It has a mechanic, it has a deli store, functions as a little bit as a grocery store. The last building that you see in the photo, the one is cut half, is of course the pub, which is a social institution. And that's pretty much. They have an oval to play footy, and then the houses, and they have a church. And there's two social groups, the people that have lived there for quite a while, and they're farmers and volunteer in the group. And they have another group, a smaller group that have moved from one town to another town looking for housing affordability. We have been talking with colleagues how housing affordability, I believe here in Taipei, is an issue. So is in Australia, and we have a group of people who live on welfare who move from one community to another looking for cheaper housing. So this town is really cut across social class. Then we have the other community, which is a little bit bigger. There I should say dairy. It's a tourist destination, but also there's a little bit of agricultural production. It has a population of 2,000 people. And it's divided on racial terms. There's an indigenous population that once you stay a few times and talk to the local and talk to the indigenous community and so forth, you start to see that also there's a divide. I want to bring some quotes from individuals, participants, and I'm going to start by taking a temporal look at justice, because I think we can understand justice also in temporal matters, not just spatially in terms of rurality and urbanity, but also temporally. So what I have here is a few quotes. The first one at the top, teaching outside your expertise. This probably will be common in many countries. I'm not going to read all the quotes because that will really put me too far away from the 40 minutes, but I'm just going to, you can read it at your own leisure. I'm just going to make a few points. The first one is the problem of many rural schools that do not have staff. So staff were complaining that they were a math teacher and they were teaching in chemistry, or they were teaching outside the area of expertise. Then we have what I call curriculum loneliness, and other people have called it too, where you have a teacher that is the only teacher in the subject area. And hence there's a sense of a professional isolation that could impact the retention of staff. Of course, there's some measures, I can get into that in the Q&A if you want, that teachers tend to do in order to redress this curriculum loneliness. And then we have a student talking about breadth of curriculum and saying how some students will feel they don't have the subjects that they want to study. And hence when they think about the future, they are clearly disadvantaged. The other issue that is very important and has become very important now in Australia, teacher shortage has arrived to Melbourne and Sydney, and that now means it's a national issue. Of course, teacher shortage was always a problem in rural parts of Australia, but now the new Labor government, the Minister of Education, the first action was introducing an array of studies to look at why teachers are abandoning the profession. And one of it is workload pressure. As you can read in the column to your left, this constantly changing the curriculum, expecting us to rewrite all the time is very hard, and maybe it's more difficult in a school where you are the only one teaching. There's still a great sense in teachers of a very heavy burden of administration. Just as a parenthesis, I'm currently conducting or just finished a study for the Australian government on why teachers stay in rural areas. And one of the reasons they don't stay is because workload, because it takes them from what they really want to do, that is being in front of the class with the students, administrative tasks and so forth. You probably maybe have this in Taiwan. I know it happens in other countries and so forth. And the other one is the notion of audit, culture of testing, accountability, and so forth. The idea for many years of teachers complaining, perhaps over the last 20 years in Australia, of teaching to the test, teaching to NAPLAN, which is a national test of literacy and numeracy, as I said before, and also teaching for PISA. And that idea that the curriculum is too strict, and hence who is the curriculum serving? And here, picking up to the previous talk by our Japanese colleague and by other colleagues yesterday, what kind of curriculum is being taught in rural schools and who does it serve? So now the question is, what kind of justice do we have in this temporal time of rural schooling, of people living, studying, working in a rural community? And I tend to think that what we have seen so far is social justice as a quality of distribution of resources rather than any issue of recognitions. Teachers argue for a politics of recognition, of being misrecognized, but it's not the same sense of misrecognized as Hornes or Fraser or even Young will think about. It's one that is based on distributive matters. There is an incipient seed of recognition in terms of being rural and hence not being respected or being invisible and so forth, but it's really based on distribution of resources. And Iris Marion Young will ask, well, equality as a structural, justice view equality of what to equality for whom? We always need to ask the question, not just about equality of what that we want, but equality of for whom. Social inequalities need to be seen through a social group lens, was the argument of Iris Marion Young. We need to think that people in many instances are disadvantaged because they belong to a social group. But it is interesting that participants show the importance of place as an analytical category, and I think this is only just taking place in the last few years or decades. There's, at least in my university, or at least in Australia, categories such as gender, race, class, disability, sexuality, have a greater importance than place. For that matter, at my university or at my faculty, rarely there's a subject on rural education. And there's a few lectures, some of them introduced by me, but you will find plenty of subjects around diversity, inclusion, and equity, and not about, have I changed the slide? Yes, not about rurality. The problem with distributive justice and equality, distributive justice matters. I don't want to make the point, as I'm generally criticized when I give this talk that, or a similar talk, that I don't think resources matter. Of course resources matter. Of course money matters, you know. There's phrase, do you have the phrase, money doesn't buy happiness? El dinero no compra la felicidad. That's in Spanish. Well, I think it's pretty close to buying it, but in any case, I'll take it. In any ways, joke apart, I think distribution of resources is very important. Go tell individuals or social groups that do not have those resources that distribution of resources don't matter. The problem is seeing equality as sameness. That was one of the main arguments of Iris Marion Young. And this generates what our previous colleague and other colleagues have said, it makes place blind. When we look at a sameness of resources as urban similar to rural, we tend to forget about the importance of the distinctions of individual social groups, of nature, of economies, of geographies, of infrastructure, of transport, and so forth, you name it, of all the things that compose a place. So when we talk about equality as sameness, that I think is kind of a problem. And equality as a unit of judgment does not challenge what education is for. At the end of the day, the quest is to understand what is education for rural students? What is education for rural schools? What is the point of it? The nature and rules of institution, who gets what, says Iris Young, reifies the distribution of material schools as panacea for all maladies. That was her main argument. We are focusing too much on having rather than doing. I want to bring a few more quotes, knowledgeable that I'm 5 minutes. I'm checking myself, as you can see, don't need to put it. I have to watch this here, so I'm on top of it. I'm pretty proud of myself, actually. And I have here, looking at the future pedagogies of aspiration and mobility, social justice as merit in the future. If you go back at your own time to that slide with the many policies, you'll see one that is called Bradley Review, or at least what was done by a person, last name called Bradley. I forgot her first name. And it was in 2008, and it was a review of higher education in Australia. And the aspiration was to have in 2020, looked like in the past, when in 2023, almost 2024, to have 40% of 18 to 24-year-old Australians studying in higher education. And the buzzword was aspiration. We need to aspire. And again, equity groups, again, rural people do not have the capacity to aspire. What is wrong with them? Indigenous people are failing to aspire, of course, because they're not attending higher education at the same rate as urban or high or mid SES and so forth. Of course, there are also just sorts of challenges, and of course, the whole idea that they don't have the capacity to aspire is mistaken. But here we have a quote of 2 students, both of them praising the idea of aspiration and the idea of out-migration, you know. With the university, people that have the money can get no matter what some score they get, they have, but if you don't have money, you have to get a very high one, but nonetheless, if you really want it, you can have it. And the other one also talks about this idea of self-realization, acknowledges that private schools have more resources, tutor and so forth, but what comes here into play, and I will say in the uncertainty of life when we look at the future, what comes to play here is this notion of self-realization. There are these so-called neoliberal sensibilities, if I can put it in this way, that if you work hard enough, you can make it. Well, it might well be true. Hollywood have plenty of movies of self-realization, of people that come from very poor backgrounds and have made it. I don't want to present as some structural determinism where you are born determines forever your destiny. I don't think that is right. But on the other hand, the problem of this notion of self-realization and merit and so forth is that it tends to mask the structural injustices that some social groups and some students and some individuals have to fight double to overcome. And it tends to individualize the structural injustices as the problem of the individual. And hence, when the individual fails, it's not the problem of society or how society is structured, but really is the problem of the child, the family, and so forth. We come to out-migration, which has been a big talk in this day and a half. Is departure inevitable? Who stays and who leaves? And if I go back to these 2 communities, and particularly to the small community, what I found is that the children of the farmers, some of them asset-rich, perhaps cash flow poor, tend to have what the government would say the right aspiration, the right capacity to aspire to higher education or vocational studies and so forth. They have the right cultural capital and so on. And the ones that tend to stay, and they are the future of the town, of the sustainability of the towns, are those that are marginalized, those children and young people from the welfare group, if I can call it like that, you know. So I think that is something to study and quite problematic. Pedagogies of recognition, now I have to speed up. Pedagogies of recognition, care, and respect. I better look up my slide, this is quite short. And here what we have is 2 kinds of recognitions. First of all, the one that we saw a little bit in these trips that we went with the committee organizer, in the sense of the first one, we have got a lot of teacher aides, probably a dozen or so, who most of them are parents, and when they come to the school and see their work, they value us. And in the report that I was telling you that I just finished for the government, the professional self-worth, the values that teachers can get by being seen, is very important in sense of retention of staff. And here Horneth comes a little bit into play, the theory of Axel Horneth, the notion of self-esteem and intersubjectivity and seeing the other. This is about the third type of a struggle of recognition for Axel Horneth, which is self-respect. We get our self-worth from the respect of others. We don't live individually in society, but we live in connection with others. And the respect that others give us, and when others see us and see the work that we do, generates in us that kind of self-respect that can motivate to continue us. The other one has to do more with the curriculum, and it was a history teacher, and it was seeing the other by that, giving Australia proper recognition of an indigenous history, not just a wide Australia history. So lessons from rural schooling. A politics of distribution still commands the rural education discussion. I still find that this is the question. And much of, for example, the Victorian government, where Melbourne is the capital, much of the new policies have to do with this idea of incentives, of throwing more money. And I have found in this recent report that works and doesn't tend to work. Many city graduate teachers go for a little bit to the rural community, they get their bonus, and when they see there's no nightlife, maybe they run away back to the city. It sometimes works for rural teachers to move from one rural town to another. So distribution of resources still commands the argument. It is important, but it's not enough. Equality as sameness, putting urban as the norm and rural as the other is a very poor version of social justice, and I think everybody knows this and has been said here, so I don't need to go there. In terms of uncertainty, I have found merit trumps equality. When we feel uncertainty and we don't know the future, we perhaps tend to that idea of self-realization that we can make it. And another important thing is the weak pedagogy of place. But can place-based education be the solution? There was a big discussion in the previous session, so I won't go there. Philosophically, I agree with place-based education, but I think there's a little bit more to be thought there. There's a little bit more to thought in the terms of nature, in the scales of the economy of the place and other things. Rural schools or teacher alone cannot solve social inequality or rural sustainability. I was saying Professor Corbett that once talking to Michael Apple when he was producing or launching his book, Can Schools Change Society? I was the pessimist saying that they cannot. Of course, they play a big role, but I think a structural difference and inequalities and injustices in society need a little bit more than just teachers will solve the problem. Very quickly, in my last minute, socially just rural education. Following Horneth, the root of recognition problem of rural education appears to lie in the institutional pattern of cultural misrecognition in research, policy, and practice about rural education. And I think this continues. I see it in research, I see it in policy, and I see it in practice. Rural education continues to be a sort of a cousin, a sort of a minor field of study, if I could say so. Following young, hopeful policy and research in rural schooling should expand the social justice agenda to include issues related to autonomy, power, dignity, respect, and participation for teachers, for students, for rural schools, and so forth. And a few more points and I'm done. A plural view of social justice that make the process of education and teaching as relevant as the products. Without looking at the process, understanding, constructing socially just process, clearly we're not going to reach a socially just outcome of education. Finally, it's important when we think about socially just education to ask these critical questions that are perhaps too big for me to answer today, or perhaps in this conference. What kind of curriculum is taught in schools? What kind of knowledge is valued? What kind of power relations and structure are constructed and sustained in schools? What is the degree of participation of different actors in decision-making spheres? Thank you.
谢谢那个我们 Professor Cuervo 的精彩的演说。我们希望 有更多时间哈。那我简要的说一下哈，就是怎么样去迈向那个所谓社会正义的偏乡教育哈。那Cuervo 教授他提到2个主要的那个社会正义的理论哈，一个是分配正义啊，另外一个就是认可正义哈。这个昨天在郑教授的演说，郑同僚教授的演说应该也提到了哈。那比较难得的，我觉得是他刚刚介绍了，他用了一些实证性研究啊来去证明哈，就是来佐证了哈这2个主要的理论哈。那他当然也提到几位教授哈的说法哈，像 Fraser 的理论，它是比较双重论哈，就是比较 dualism 哈。那另外一位 Honest 的理论是比较单元，就是单子论哈 monism 哈。那这个双元理论意思就是说，这两种正义论应该是等同去看哈。那Honest 的观点是认为说，那个认可的正义应该是优先于那个所谓分配正义哈。那最后的结论是说，其实这个分配正义的一个概念哈，还是很重要的哈，就是在我们的研究里，虽然我们觉得认可正义也是我们需要努力的目标哈，然后也提到那个所谓社会正义的多元理论，其实跟那个情境是有关的哈。比如说我们在座的有我们来自不同国家哈，包括日本哈，包括澳洲，包括加拿大，包括台湾哈，全世界各国的偏乡教育，它有一些相同性，也有一些差异性哈。那这个跟那个情境论也是有很大的关系哈。然后所以他认为说，其实我们更努力的是要去了解这个整体的哈，就是包括回到那个教学的本质里头，其实这两个正义的理论其实都很重要，甚至我们觉得教学还有教育过程跟结果都非常重要啊，这不是只有看绩效啊，其实就像刚刚教授在讲的过程当中也提到说，其实我们台湾也是一样，我们大概就是考试领导教学啊，那事实上那个学习的过程也是很重要啊。那我想说我们这4场演说啊，就主题演讲到现在，我们围绕的就是对于那个偏乡教育的关怀哈。我相信我们在座很多的教授，很多的现场的实务工作者对这个议题其实都蛮关注的哈。那我想接下来时间哈，是不是就交给大家哈？就是从这四场的主题演讲，其实围绕着相同的问题哈。那我觉得 Cuervo 教授给我们的这个有深度的这个理论的思考，特别是正义论的思考哈，我觉得是很重要的哈。那我们想说，在座的我们的师长，还有我们在座的实务工作者，甚至有研究生嘛哈，看看有什么问题没有？来这边。
你好。我是来自花莲的丰滨乡港口部落的达木拉可阿美语共学员，我在那边教书这样子。那我们是一个就是从各个家庭自学，然后就是一起共学的一个团体。然后目前的话，从幼儿园一直到中学国中7年级都有这样子，对。那就是我们其实跟昨天其实也有那个来自港口国小的老师，就是做他的论文发表嘛。那我们其实都在同一个部落里面。那港口国小目前呢，就是已经不到10位的孩子在那边读书。那我们的共学员呢，目前呢总共有就是18位的国小、国中小孩，然后加上了就是大概有7位的幼儿园的孩子这样子。那因为从昨天听到现在啊，就是这样的一些偏乡教育的或是小校的部分啊，都是会再怎么样都还是有政府的资源挹注的。那因为我们是共学团体，那当我们在做这样子的一个民族教育的时候呢，我们所有的资源呢都是要来自于自己这样子。那所以其实有时候可以就是说有的家长他们其实可能因为我们要付的学费相对会是比较多的，相对的成本各种是比较多的，所以还能够在我们这样的一个小小地方，然后能够有就是20多位快要30位的孩子在我们这边读书，那我们其实是很感恩的。那可是相对的就是我们其实就真的我们完全没有办法有任何立场去谈所谓的公平公义什么这样的任何的事情，因为我们全部的所有的教材是自编的，而且我们是全阿美语在教学，是对。然后 所以就是我想说，不晓得就是有没有可能，未来有没有可能，就是针对这样子的一个自学团体，不论是不是原住民，因为我们花莲也有其他自学团体，然后也是很辛苦，只是因为我们是原住民团体，也许我们还有那个立场跟社会大众就是募款或什么的。那可是其实我们的家长每个月的付出还是一样相对很多，包括就是所有小孩的，因为我们每一个家庭是轮流带所有孩子们的午餐的这样食材，就一起每天都是这样子过这样子。对，那就是就是在谈正义或是教育的时候，能不能够就是也有把我们就是纳入进去这样子？谢谢。
谢谢我们老师在那个部落里面的自学团体我觉得蛮辛苦的那因为教授也提到那个政策面其实也很重要，就是民间跟政府怎么样协力好，这是第一个问题接着OK， 好，那我们就一个一个OK。
I have a terrible memory. I forget about everything. So she'll become a Blair, and that will be really disrespectful. Well, I think first of all, I need to take this because it means like the Matrix, the two of us. I think first of all, it's very, as you put it, very worthwhile what you and your colleagues and parents are doing. I think that is wonderful and very important. It opens all sorts of questions. First of all, why you don't have support from government, which I don't know. I'm not an expert in the area. Second, it opens the idea of the involvement of parents in schools. We notice in the two schools that we visit with Professor Corbett and the committee organizer, in one school, parents were heavily involved, and the other one, they weren't. And here the question is also about have and have-nots. I'm not talking about your situation as I don't know it, but in general, at least if I could think about Australia, some schools will generate or do fundraising, some wealthy schools, and the capacity that they have to raise, the capacity in terms of resources is much more important than others, And I think there's a big and strong equity issue on what you're saying. And it seems to me from what you are saying without not knowing the situation that you are being disadvantaged for whatever reason is that the government doesn't recognize the homeschooling of indigenous individuals. The second question is an issue of recognition of culture. And what we were talking here is a misrecognition of the social status or the cultural resignification of indigenous people in your case. So at play, I can see several issues which I'm not sure what is the solution or why you arrived to this situation. But the point you're making is very interesting and speak to the lecturer and what I was trying to say, that understanding justice, as Brian Bowery, as many other political theories now escape my mind, or even John Rawls for that matter, in an abstract way, is very dangerous in a sense, because we don't get the context of the situations of injustices and the processes of educations and the profound labor that you and the other parents or your colleagues are doing, So you brought a very good example, probably better than me, to the notion of justice needs to be contextualized in order to make sure that everybody gets their fair share, but also that every culture is recognized and that cultural status matters. Not just economic justice, but cultural justice is also important.
结论也是说，其实经济的那个正义跟文化的正义要同时啦哈。那不过就是说，刚刚有提到原住民族的那个理念学校，它其实刚教授也提到就是募款嘛募款是一个啦，其实更强调的是说，要让大家能够接受就是那个所谓认可那个部分因为大部分就是说原住民的这个理念学校是不是很多人去支持他？那因为你要靠那个家长去募款，我觉得还是有困难政府怎么去支持他那因为那个认可其实牵涉到很多刚刚提到那个自主性权利的关系尊严这个尊重还有参与其实这很多元素在里面其实真的也很辛苦，也很不容易那可能我们没有办法马上给答案好，那我们接着 来这边继续询问。嘿，
Yeah, thank you for the inspiring speech. So I have two questions for Professor. 不好意思，好，不好意思，教授。我想要问2个问题。第一个问题是关于就是谈到在偏乡学校的就是老师是很孤单 loneliness 的这个议题。那我自己也发现说，其实台湾有蛮多的教育者，他们在偏乡学校的时候，他们其实非常的有热情，然后也想要继续的做，不管是不同的教育理念或者是在地课程的实践，但这个状态其实并不一定被他的场域，就是他的同事、学校，或者说不一定被他的村落认可。那在这个状况下，我想要请教您，就是您的观点会认为说，我们怎么样建立一个支持的系统，可以帮助这些很有热情的老师，他们可以继续的去不是只是燃烧他们的热情，就是我们台湾有一句话说，就是你的那个热情像蜡烛一样，就是烧完就没有了。对，所以要怎么样子去不要让这件事情就是烧完没有，而是可以一直永续的，然后持续进行。那第2个问题是关于您刚刚提到在认知正义里面，关于我们是不是误解了某一些文化族群或社会族群，那导致说这些既定的印象会形成了我们在教育内容上的制定。那所以也想请教一下，就是我认为文化它也是一个不断的去生成与更新它自己的一个状态。那如果是在这样的情况下，我们要怎么就是既有一个对于不同文化族群的认识，同时我们并且保持着这样子的敏感度，知道说，其实我们现在对于这个族群的认识并不完全，就文化是有可能改变的。例如在我们台湾的话是，我们知道说原住民他们是相对于汉人优势族群来说，他们有一些比较辛苦的状况，但其实我们也看到说有一些原住民家庭试图会去移动到都市里面居住，那所以说我们要怎么样，就是仍然知道说这有一个社会正义的问题，我们不是因为他们到都市之后我们就不再关注他们，而是说我们要了解说他们其实也是有主体性，他们也在有那个移动，我们不要完全用一个文化的认知就定位他们。对，谢谢。
Two questions.
I hope that I understood both questions. The first one, I think it relates to teacher isolation. Well, in the examples in these 2 schools and many parts of Australia, and I'm sure many parts around the world, probably in Taiwan too, teachers are not passive actors, or they're not victims. They also are actors that are I mean, it's not an idea, do you have agency or not? That is kind of a silly binary proposition. But they are individuals that have the capacity to redress injustices. In these 2 schools that I was mentioning, particularly the smaller school, teachers organize cluster or hubs with nearby schools from nearby communities. Of course, that came in the first instance to the expense of teachers' time and teacher financial resources and so on. Later on, one of the important things is the organization from teachers, be that through a union, be that through a cooperative, be that through whatever kind of structure you want to put it, and lobbying government in order to get the support for them to get financial resources, time of work, and so forth, to organize themselves, to get those resources in order to form a cluster of teachers when you are the only teacher teaching in your area. One of the things that happened also is COVID. It happens around the world, but in Victoria, the state of Victoria, where this study was conducted, where I come from, and in Melbourne, we had the longest lockdown in the world. Not that we are too proud of that, actually the contrary. But that happened mostly for Melbourne, for the city, not so much for rural area. But one of the things that we're finding out is the government discover online. They discover Zoom, which is quite interesting, given that Australia has a long history of what is called the School of the Air. The School of the Air is distance education that runs since, I believe, 1940s, 1950s. So much of professional development now for rural teachers or regional teachers is conducted over online resources or Zoom or WebEx or whatever platform, and teachers seems to be quite happy with that. So teachers organizing, teachers coming together, It is staff, parents, communities. It is very important in order to change reality. So we shouldn't view teachers or communities or rural communities just as victims and passive. The second question, I'm not so sure I understood it so much, but I think you mentioned about the change of culture and the migration of indigenous individuals to urban places. That was more a statement. What would be the question? I'm not so sure I understand it. Or I can make a comment, try to understand it if not.
So in my opinion, I think culture is a keep generating concept. So my question is, how do we keep this awareness about how we knowing about the culture's differences in different groups, but how do we also thinking about how the cultures also will keep generating and changing by themselves. So we're not just doing when we recognize one of the group, we not just make this recognition as a stereotype, and we keep this idea to marginalize our solution for them. We just keep being awareness. So I wonder, how do we, keep this kind of awareness for them? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very important question, a very big question for me to answer. But if I can relate it again back to Australia, we recently have something called The Voice. Do you know what is The Voice, or what was The Voice? Probably not, in the sense that it was a very Australian-based issue. Basically, it was a proposition put by indigenous communities, and there's not just one indigenous communities, there are many indigenous communities, indigenous tribes, indigenous nations, indigenous groups in Australia, I would say on the dozens or hundreds. And the idea was, to put in a very, very simplistic way, to have a committee that had a direct access to the national cabinet to advise in ideas or affairs that attain to indigenous people. This doesn't mean that the cabinet or prime minister had to take action, that the committee said X, Z, and Y, and the prime minister and the cabinet had to follow. It was just an advice. And it was also a recognition in the constitution of indigenous people. According to some commentators, and I tend to agree, this was a very mild proposition in terms of the recognition of indigenous Australian and giving them more power, autonomy, a say, a voice, which is, I think, what you're trying to get at, a voice. Well, this was defeated, 60-40. 60 people in Australia voted for no, that this shouldn't happen because it was creating a third chamber of parliament, which was not true, and so forth. So you can see that the evolution or the constant recognition of indigenous culture, or for that matter, any culture, migrant cultures, I don't know, not just indigenous people, rural culture, is something that is a work of every day. And it's something that everybody has to take part, and not just the people involved, that is indigenous people in this case. And in the case of the teacher in the presentation, which was a white Australian middle-aged teacher who was very much involved in trying to teach white Australian kids, if I can put those labels, about Australia having an indigenous history, not just a white history, a little bit like Professor Corber talked about Canada, the terra nullius, that was what British, when they came to Australia, declared that was a land that was not habitated, that indigenous people were basically not people, but that was an empty land for them to take and so forth. Well, all this work is not just the work of those that are affected by the misrecognition. I think it's a work of all society, It's a work of all teachers, it's a work of people that are non-indigenous, people that are indigenous, and so forth. Having said all this, well, some people might disagree with me, and clearly 60% of Australians disagree with what I will think is a very mild proposition of having a cabinet to provide some advice a committee to provide some advice to the cabinet, And it was a shock for those of us that supported the motion, and I think it in some ways made a great disservice to Australia in the continuous treatment of indigenous people, in the sense that they are not able to have a say. So it's always a work in progress in the same way as you mentioned the teachers. But I think the organizing is very important. I think the moving from big teams to actors that have the potential to change a reality with all the acknowledging constraints is also very important.
好，那因为那个原住民族的问题，其实涉及到的是政策啊，还有文化认可，其实还蛮复杂。不管是澳洲或者是台湾哈，甚至日本或者是加拿大，还有其他国家哈。那刚刚提到那个老师的这个，就是在偏乡的老师缺乏支持度这个部分，教授也提到说，怎么样给他像用那个线上团体的支持哈，我觉得也是一种啦哈。那其实就是说怎么样去形成我们讲的这个专业学习社群哈，让老师们可以在对偏乡，就像我们今天在这里哈，就是参加论坛，大家有共同的信念理念哈，支持下去哈，才能够就像刚刚讲的，就是说怎么样留住偏乡的老师哈，其实这是一个蛮大的一个议题哈。那因为我们的时间也差不多到这边哈，那我想我们待会如果中午的时间可能也可以跟我们在座的几位教授好好去讨论啊。那就今天非常感谢那个我们 Professor Cuervo 啊精彩的这个演说啊，以及我们刚刚很好的问答哈，我们可以继续讨论下去哈，因为偏乡教育的问题其实是重大议题哈，谢谢大家。